In the late 1950s, the United States was terrified of a number it could not see. The number was how many nuclear missiles the Soviet Union actually had. Not how many Moscow claimed, not how many a frightened headline imagined, but the real figure, the one that would decide whether America built 1,000 missiles of its own or 10,000, whether the Cold War stayed cold or tipped into the thing everyone feared. And the maddening truth was that nobody in Washington knew. The Soviet Union was a closed country the size of a continent, sealed behind borders that no reporter, no diplomat, and no spy could cross freely. The most important fact of the age was hidden, and the not knowing was driving the world toward catastrophe. This is the story of how the United States finally got the number. It did it with a machine so secret that its existence was hidden behind a fake science program, a machine that failed humiliatingly a dozen times in a row before it worked, and that on a single morning in 1960 photographed more of the Soviet Union than every spy plane in American history combined. Its name was Corona, and almost everything we can say about it now comes from the CIA's own declassified history of the program, opened to the public decades later by a stroke of a president's pen. Start with the fear, because the fear is what made the machine necessary. In the 1950s, the Soviets had detonated a hydrogen bomb, unveiled a long-range bomber, and tested an intercontinental ballistic missile, a rocket that could carry a warhead from Russia to America in half an hour. American politicians and newspapers began to talk about a bomber gap, and then a missile gap, the terrifying idea that the Soviet Union was racing ahead and that the United States was falling dangerously behind. The gap became a political weapon. It shaped elections and budgets. In the 1960 presidential campaign, the missile gap was a live and potent charge, the accusation that the country had been allowed to fall behind, and it helped carry John Kennedy into the White House. The irony, which almost no one could see at the time because the evidence was still locked away, is that the satellites were about to prove the gap had been an illusion all along. The fear had already done its work on the politics before the facts ever arrived. The only problem was that no one could prove the gap was real, because no one could actually see inside the Soviet Union to count. For a while, America had one answer to that problem, and it flew. The U-2 spy plane could cross Soviet territory at altitudes above 70,000 feet, higher, the CIA hoped, than any Soviet weapon could reach, and its cameras brought back extraordinary images. But everyone involved knew the U-2 was living on borrowed time. It was only a matter of years, maybe months, before Soviet air defenses could climb high enough to knock it down. And on the 1st of May, 1960, that day arrived. A Soviet missile struck a U-2 over the city of Sverdlovsk, deep inside Russia. The plane came apart. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, parachuted into Soviet hands, and the United States was caught in a humiliating public lie about what the flight had been. Overflights of the Soviet Union by aircraft were finished. The one window America had into the closed country had just been slammed shut, on camera, in front of the world. But by then, a far stranger idea was already years into development. If you could not fly a camera over the Soviet Union, what if you flew it over the top of the entire planet? What if you put the camera in space? It sounds obvious now, in an age when we carry satellite maps in our pockets. In the late 1950s, it was at the absolute edge of the possible. The plan was almost absurd in its difficulty. You would launch a satellite, carrying a long roll of special film and a panoramic camera. As it passed over Soviet territory, the camera would photograph the ground far below. Then, and this is the part that still sounds like fiction, the satellite would load the exposed film into a small re-entry capsule, fire the capsule out of orbit, and drop it back through the atmosphere under a parachute. And as that capsule drifted down over the Pacific Ocean, an airplane, trailing a hook and a net, would fly into its path and snatch it out of the open sky. No radio could transmit a photograph from orbit with anything close to the detail they needed, so the physical film itself had to come home. They were going to throw a bucket of secrets off the top of the world and catch it with an airplane. There was a hard reason the capsule had to be caught in the air rather than simply allowed to land. A roll of film showing the secret interior of the Soviet Union was one of the most sensitive objects on Earth, and if one of those buckets came down in the wrong place, it could fall into the wrong hands. That was not a hypothetical worry. Early in the program, a test capsule re-entered off course and came down somewhere near the Arctic island of Svalbard, far to the north, and was never found. To this day, no one can say for certain it did not end up in Soviet hands. So the recovery had to be precise, and it had to happen over open ocean, with an American aircraft positioned to pluck the prize out of the sky before it ever touched the water. A missed catch meant a desperate scramble to reach a floating capsule before anyone else did. Now, you cannot do something like this in secret while also launching rockets that the whole world can see climbing off the launch pad. Rockets are loud and bright and public, so the program needed a cover story, a believable lie to explain why the United States kept launching satellites that kept dropping capsules into the ocean. And the cover they built was a fake space science program called Discoverer. To the public, Discoverer was presented as a research effort, a series of missions to test space technology and to study the effects of spaceflight on living things. The returning capsules, the press was told, were bringing back biological specimens. To sell that story, the program actually built capsules designed to carry a monkey, and the unglamorous, often grim reality behind the cover was that a number of test animals died during ground testing of the capsule's life support system. Casualties of a science program that was itself a mask for something else entirely. The world watched Discoverer launch and saw a curious, slightly eccentric space experiment. What it was actually watching was the birth of orbital espionage. And at first, the espionage did not work. This is the part of the Corona story that gets left out of the triumphant version, and it is the part I find most human. The program failed and failed and failed again. Rockets exploded. Satellites reached orbit but tumbled out of control. Capsules came down in the wrong place or sank or were never recovered. Cameras jammed. Film tore. One mission after another ended in some new and creative form of disaster. By most accounts, the program suffered roughly a dozen consecutive failures before anything worked at all. In almost any other context, a program with that record would have been killed. Engineers were demoralized. The cost was enormous. And the only reason Corona survived its own catastrophic infancy was that the people at the very top understood how badly the country needed the number and were willing to keep paying for failure in the hope of an eventual success. President Eisenhower, who had been burned by the U-2 affair, kept his patience and kept the money flowing. That patience finally paid off in August of 1960, just months after the U-2 was shot down. The mission designated Discoverer 13 did what 12 missions before it could not. Its capsule came home. It carried no camera, it was a test of the recovery system itself, and it splashed down and was retrieved, the first man-made object ever brought back from orbit. A small American flag had been flown inside it, and that flag was carried to Washington and presented to President Eisenhower in the Oval Office. After a year of public embarrassment and secret disaster, the system had, at last, closed the loop. They had put something in orbit and gotten it back. And then, days later, came the mission that changed the strategic balance of the Cold War. Discoverer 14 carried a working camera loaded with film. It went up, it passed over the Soviet Union again and again, and its panoramic camera ran, exposing frame after frame of territory that no American had laid eyes on in years. When the film was spent, the capsule separated, fired its retro rockets, and fell toward the Pacific. Out over the ocean, southwest of Hawaii, a U.S. Air Force C-119 transport plane with the call sign Pelican 9 was waiting. On its third pass of the descending parachute, the aircraft's recovery gear caught the capsule in midair and hauled it aboard. It was the first time in history that film had been recovered from a satellite in orbit, and the first time anyone had snatched a returning spacecraft out of the sky. What was on that film rewrote everything. That single flight photographed something on the order of 1.5 million square miles of Soviet territory. In one mission, Corona brought back more imagery of the Soviet Union than every U-2 flight ever flown, combined. Years of dangerous, deniable airplane missions, all of it, surpassed in an afternoon by a camera falling out of orbit. Analysts suddenly had a sweeping view into the closed country, its airfields, its bomber bases, and most importantly, the places where its missiles were and were not. And here's what the pictures showed. The gap was a myth. The missile gap, the terrifying engine of so much fear and so much spending, did not exist the way the country had believed. When American analysts finally counted, using the hard evidence of photographs instead of the soft fog of estimates, they found that the Soviet Union had far fewer intercontinental missiles than the nightmare scenarios had assumed. The enemy was real, the danger was real, But the specific, panic-inducing number at the center of the arms race had been wrong. The United States was not falling behind in the way the headlines screamed. It had been frightening itself with a figure it could not check. It is hard to overstate what that meant. A government that does not know how strong its rival is will tend to assume the worst and arm against the worst. And an opponent watching that build-up will do the same. And the spiral feeds itself toward more weapons and more danger. Corona broke that spiral by replacing imagination with measurement. Years later, when the program was finally made public, an acting director of the CIA put it about as plainly as it can be put. The imagery, he said, allowed the country to base its national security strategy and its spending on facts rather than fear, on information rather than imagination. That is the real achievement of Corona. Not the spectacle of catching a bucket with an airplane, remarkable as that was, but the quiet victory of a fact over a fear. Once it worked, Corona did not stop. What began as a desperate gamble became a routine, a steady eye in the sky. The cameras improved with each generation, and the system carried a codename that captured exactly what it was: Keyhole. Each new model wore a number, and the engineers eventually mounted 2 panoramic cameras instead of 1, angled forward and back, so the satellite could build stereo, 3-dimensional views of the ground. The resolution climbed until analysts could pick out objects only a few feet across from 100 miles up. Down on the ground, in secure buildings, photo interpreters bent over light tables hour after hour, reading those long strips of film frame by frame, counting aircraft on runways, measuring the length of missiles, watching construction crawl across distant test ranges. The pictures did not interpret themselves. An entire hidden profession grew up around learning to read them. The capsules multiplied. The cover story was quietly retired. The discoverer name dropped. The launches reclassified simply as Defense Department business that no one was invited to ask about. Over 12 years, from 1960 to 1972, the program launched on the order of 145 satellites and brought home more than 800,000 images, something like 2 million feet of film, an archive of the hidden half of the world. Every president of that era made decisions about war and peace with Corona's pictures on the desk in front of him. And the program kept its secret well. Corona stayed classified for decades after the last satellite flew. The public knew nothing of it. The men who had built it and flown its recovery missions could not tell their families what they had done. Thousands of people touched Corona over its life. Engineers and camera makers and rocket crews and pilots and photo interpreters. And the secret held. No great leaks, no tell-all memoirs, no congressional blow-ups. For 3 decades. Part of that was the cover story doing its work. Part of it was a generation that had learned in a world war to keep quiet. And part of it was that the people inside believed the secret was worth keeping, that the country was genuinely safer for not advertising just how well it could see. When the declassification finally came, some of those old engineers and pilots are said to have wept, because for the first time, they could tell their children what they had actually done with their lives. They had helped end the guessing. It was only in 1995 that a president signed an executive order declassifying the imagery, opening the Corona archive and the history behind it to the public, releasing the old film to the National Archives, and, of all places, to the U.S. Geological Survey, where those Cold War spy photographs found a strange second life, helping scientists study how the planet itself had changed over 40 years. The keyhole that had been opened to count Soviet missiles became, in the end, a record of the whole Earth. There is one more consequence of all this that reaches straight into the decades that followed, and it may be the most important of all. Once each side could photograph the other from orbit, it became possible, for the first time, to make arms control agreements that did not depend on trust. A treaty limiting missiles is only worth the paper it is printed on if you can tell whether the other side is cheating. Before the satellites, you could not, and so every proposal foundered on suspicion. After Corona and the systems that grew out of it, you could verify. You could count the other side's missiles from space and check the real number against their promises. When the 2 superpowers finally signed their first major treaty limiting strategic arms, in the very year Corona flew its last mission, they wrote into it a careful phrase protecting each side's national technical means of verification. That bloodless bit of jargon was, in plain language, the spy satellites. The eye in the sky did not only measure the threat, it made it possible to begin, slowly and warily, to wind the threat back down. That is the turn that makes Corona a sources and methods story, rather than just a feat of engineering. The same secrecy that protected the program for 30 years eventually gave way, and when it did not reveal a scandal. It revealed the opposite. It revealed a government that had been blind, that had been frightening itself toward an arms race in the dark, and that had spent 6 years and a fortune and a dozen failed launches to do something genuinely difficult and genuinely wise, to go and look, to replace a rumor with a photograph, to find out the real number instead of arming against the imaginary one. There is a lesson in that worth holding on to because it runs against the grain of how we usually think about secret programs. We expect the classified file to hide wrongdoing. Sometimes it hides something better. Sometimes, behind the cover story and the lost monkeys and the string of public failures, there is a serious attempt to swap fear for fact, to know the world as it actually is instead of as the most frightened voice in the room insists it must be. Corona was that. A bucket of secrets thrown off the top of the world and caught in midair, so that a nation could finally stop guessing. The film is in the archives now. The history is declassified. You can look at the same pictures the presidents looked at and read the program's own account of how it nearly failed before it changed the Cold War. Read it yourself in the links below. The next file is already on the table.